Hello everyone, and welcome to this live instructor chat for adaptive or therapeutic horseback riding instructors. My name is Sabra Popoli. I'm the owner and founder of Hoof Falls and Footfalls. I am a certified equine professional in the equine assisted services industry, and I specialize in adaptive or therapeutic riding lessons, equine assisted learning, and traditional lessons as well. So today on this live chat, we are going to be talking about saddle fit to the rider. So a lot of times we focus on saddle fit to the horse, but it's thrown out there that we need to also make sure that the saddle fits the rider. But sometimes there's not additional conversation beyond that. So in this live chat, we'll be talking about one, what does it mean to have a good fit to a saddle, or have a good fit of a saddle to a rider? So what are we looking for? How can we check the fit? If it is better to have a small saddle to a big rider, so a rider that's, or a saddle that's a little bit too small, or do we want a saddle that's a little bit too big for the rider if we are encountering that situation? And then we'll also talk about what happens when the saddle is too small or too big and how that impacts the rider, their position, possibly demeanor, how that impacts the horse, the mechanics of riding. And then also some possible solutions for if your tack or equipment is too small or your equipment is too big, and just some general takeaway points. So for those of you that are jumping on live, if you can let me know where you're watching from. If you're even watching on a replay, feel free to comment, say where you're watching from, and I want you guys to give me your input. What do you think is better? Is it better to have a saddle that is too small for the rider or too big for the rider? Which one is better and why? So we'll kind of open up that discussion. We'll really dig into that during this live chat. I appreciate any likes or comments or anything on the live stream or on a replay, because that helps Facebook and YouTube or podcasts or whatever you're listening to on kick this out for more instructors to see. Feel free to share. You can use this as continuing education, and this is specifically formatted for adaptive or therapeutic riding instructors in mind. All right, so what is a good saddle fit? So I've got three different saddles here. I have my dressage saddle under here, but we have our English saddle here, and we have our Western saddle here. So what we're looking for with fit is when the rider is sitting in the saddle, how much room on a Western saddle can you fit between the rider's thigh and the swell or the fork of the saddle here, so this location. Ideally, you want to fit 3 to 4 fingers in between the swell or the fork of the saddle and where that rider's leg would be. That's kind of general rule of thumb. Depending on discipline that you're looking to do, if it's cutting or barrel racing or ranch riding or just general riding, that might shift a little bit depending on if you need to be held in tighter or you need a little bit more room to move with the horse. But kind of general rule of thumb where we should be starting at as adaptive riding instructors is that 3 to 4 fingers in between the swell and the thigh of the rider, that front part of the rider's thigh. Then in the back, you are going to be looking for about 4 fingers width between the top of the seat and where the rider's bottom hits the saddle. If you have less than that number of fingers, that means that the saddle is probably too small, the seat size is too small. If you have more than that, then the saddle is probably too big for that rider. And a lot of times our riders sit too far back in the seat of the saddle, both in Western and in English or dressage. So make sure that your rider is sitting down in that dip of the saddle there so that we can look at the fit and see if it's fitting them appropriately. English saddles, again, we're looking for 3 fingers or so in between the front of the saddle and the leg or the crotch area, depending on if it's more of a forward seat saddle where the flap's a little bit more rounded, or a dressage saddle that might vary a little bit, but you do want some room in between the front of the crotch and the front of the saddle. If you have a cutback saddle, so here where this cutback's a little bit more, that's going to vary things, but standard saddles that we use, kind of an all-purpose English or dressage saddle, you do want to be able to fit 3 or 4 fingers in the front. And then same thing, 2 to 3 fingers in the back behind where the rider's bottom touches the saddle. If you have more than that, like a full hand plus, seat's probably too big. If you have less than that, 2 finger, 1 finger, no fingers, seat is probably a little bit too small. So that's what we're looking for when we are seeing if a saddle fits the rider. I have provided some links to some really good resources for you guys in the comments of, or I'm sorry, not the comments, the video description for those of you that are joining on live. If you're watching on a replay, check the description of the video or the description of the podcast and it'll be in there. My favorite resource is the number 1 that is listed because it gives photos and it talks about both English and Western saddles. If you're only English or if you're only Western, then I provided a couple different resources for you, but I really like resource number 1. All right, so we talked about what does a good saddle fit look like. Saddle seat sizes, if you guys don't know how saddle seat sizes are measured, from a Western saddle, we're going to measure from the center of the horn, like just behind it, to the center of the cantle, and however many inches that is going to be the seat size. Then for an English saddle, we measure from this little button right here, kind of at a somewhat diagonal line, over to the center of the cantle. Generic rule of thumb is that if you ride in a 17-inch seat, so from button to back of the cantle here, in an English saddle, you're probably going to be looking at a 15-inch, so minus 2 inches, saddle seat for the Western. So just subtract 2, kind of rule of thumb if you're going from English to Western. If you're going from Western to English, add 2. There is a document on there that shows you how you can actually measure the thigh length of a rider from their knee to their hip to determine generic saddle seat size that you're wanting to look for. And there's also a little chart of kind of a standard seat size for English and for Western that you can look for based off of typical youth, typical adult, typical teens, so on and so forth. All right, so again, those of you that are joining in live, if you want to drop a comment where you're listening from. Hi, Monica. Hi, Diane. Thank you guys for joining in. And we are going to be talking about now small saddles and big riders. And Monica actually brought up a really good point, and I'm glad she did. Something I do want to reinforce is that even though we are touching on the importance of the saddle fit to the rider, we should prioritize the fit of the saddle to the horse first, because that horse needs to be wearing that equipment and they need to be comfortable. It would just be like asking you to go out and teach a lesson to the best of your ability, be on your best behavior as an instructor, and have you wear shoes that are too small or too big, or something's rubbing your heel. That's going to alter your gait, your movement, how you stand, your personality, your temperament during that time, your focus. So priority goes to saddle fit to horse, but then we do also need to think about saddle fit to rider then. All right, so talking about what happens if we have a small saddle and the rider is too big for it. So scenarios that this could happen in is we have a small saddle for a smaller size horse, say a pony or a little 14-3 hand petite Arab or petite quarter horse, and we need to use smaller equipment on it based off of the build, or maybe that's the only equipment that we've had donated or purchased for that horse, and so we have a small saddle. And that rider that comes in, either they're a new student and they are beyond the traditional range of the saddle, or you have a student that has outgrown the saddle. I've had several of my students outgrow the saddle. This is a youth saddle here. I believe it's 12 inches if I remember correctly. Usually you check under the flap here. I should know off the top of my head. But let's see here. Let's see. It's a 12 inch, I believe. Yeah. So this is a kid's saddle. Youth saddle, small. I have kids grow out of this all the time. So what happens? So when a saddle gets to be too small for the student, one, if you're not paying attention to the clearance they have in front of their thigh or behind their bottom, things that you might see in a small saddle, depending on the student and how they react, they could go anterior seat leaning forward or posterior seat where their pelvis kind of tips backwards. And we'll break those down into the two different options. So what happens if you see your rider go more anterior seat, so tilting forward, more perchy? This could be because their butt is up on the top of the back of the cantle because, again, their tushy's way out to the end and it's tipping them forward. It's literally tipping that pelvis forward. Then, in addition to that pelvis tipping forward, it might be pushing them into the pommel of this saddle, so they might be bracing with their inner thigh or bracing with their inner knee so that they can take some of the pressure from the pommel that's being pushed up potentially into that front area or the crotch area. So if we have that anterior seat, the front tip forward of the pelvis, because of how that small saddle is impacting them, we then are also going to see upper body tip forward. We might then also see lower legs sliding back and gripping the horse, and we lose balance. We're cueing the horse to go on. Maybe you have a babysitter horse, and if that rider's off balance, that horse isn't going anywhere. So anterior seat could be an outcome of it. Posterior tilt of that seat or the pelvis could be an outcome, where we have our seat tilted backwards towards the back. I tend to see that more frequently than the anterior seat, and it's not necessarily a like slouchy tilt back. It's like a tilt back and a push out of the saddle because they are trying to avoid pressure from the pommel being pushed up into them. And that tilt back and push out usually results from them pushing off of the stirrups to, again, reduce pressure and take the pommel out of the front of their crotch area there. So they push off of their stirrups. If we're pushing into our stirrups, usually our legs go forward and we're kind of in that skiing position. Knees straighten out. We slide up out of the back of our saddle. Not a good thing, okay? So we could see anterior, posterior. Some things we might hear from our students if the saddle is too small is that they're done. I don't want to ride anymore. I don't want to trot. I don't want to do a certain skill or activity because it's uncomfortable. They could be completely checked out or just maybe a little bit pushing back because something's not feeling right. Maybe they don't know what's not feeling right. They can't communicate it, and that's just the demeanor change that you see in a student if they're in a saddle that's uncomfortable. If a saddle is too small for that student, they are going to have trouble balancing over top of the horse. Think about sitting on a very small little stool versus a nice big comfy couch. If you're on a small little stool that's too small for your bottom, then you're going to have problems balancing and maintaining your position, okay? Then when we have trouble balancing and maintaining our seat position and our core and our legs, we could start pulling on reins and try to balance on our reins or pull us off of the saddle in that way. So watch out for that. Our horses are also impacted by saddles even if they fit the horse, but they're too small for the student. A lot of times, like I said, I see that student sit too far back and they're pushing themselves away from the front of the saddle, or for a Western saddle, they're pushing themselves back to avoid the the swells pushing into that inner thigh there, especially if you're doing 2-point or posting or any type of raising up in the saddle, that's gonna dig into that front area of your thigh. So then when we sit too far back on the seat of our saddle, that tips that saddle back into our horse's loin area, which can create sore backs. It can pull up on the girth and just create that tipping back motion and really create some pressure points on the back part of the saddle. If we have a student that's going more anterior, which is, for me, I find less common, and we're tipping forward in that saddle because it's too small and the seat's pushing them forward, that can create more pressure over the horse's withers and shoulders and create some pressure points there. So the saddle, even though it fits well to the horse, if it does not fit the student well, we can create problems with the horse's comfort, and the distribution of weight is not what it's supposed to be when the tack and the equipment appropriately fit both the horse and the rider. So solutions. So what happens? We have a kiddo that has outgrown the saddle, or we have a new student coming in and we really want to match them with a certain horse, but we know that saddle size that's assigned to that horse and fits the horse well is probably going to be too small. kind of limited on this option because the small saddle, or a saddle that's too small for the student, is the greater evil of the two, so to speak. It's something that you should avoid out of the two options. So solutions: one, size up to a different saddle. I know budgets, I get it. Sometimes hard to get stuff donated or hard to save up on it. It could be a horse where maybe a bigger saddle doesn't fit the horse well because it's too long for the back of that horse. So then if we can't size up an equipment, can we then do groundwork lessons until we've saved up for another saddle? Or maybe we can shift the schedule around and make a different horse and a different saddle available for that current student or that new student. If it's a new student coming in, it might be better to put them on a wait list or start them in groundwork first before you put them onto a horse in inappropriate fitting equipment for that student. That's going to set them up for less than success because they're uncomfortable, they can't maintain a good position, they can't reach a good position, and it might create safety issues with the horse too if that horse is uncomfortable. Other option could potentially also be putting that student in pads. However, big disclaimer on that, that's a whole nother topic. Pad sets, again, are an increase in challenge because you don't have the support of the saddle there for the student. You don't have the stirrups there to help support. Depending on the movement of the horse, the student could have to keep their body over top of that horse and move with the horse more. You might need sidewalkers. If it's a heavier student, heavier being teen or adult, because you're not 40 pounds anymore as a little kid, then your seat bones start getting pushed down into that saddle pad directly instead of being dispersed over a correctly fitting saddle. So pads might be a temporary option, but again, it's not a one-size-fit-all solution. So think about who you would be putting into the pads and think about the different options. Remember that our horses, or our equines, I guess if you use mules and donkeys, they are the backbone of our program. We can't do what we do without them. And so it's our job to ethically partner with them and work alongside them. And part of that is realizing our limitations when it comes to the tack and the equipment that we have that appropriately fits our equines and what we have available and the students that we can then serve from there. Backup option could also be referring them out to another program if you don't want to put them on wait lists or they don't want to start groundwork, or maybe they're not appropriate for that. So I have limitations on the tack and the equipment I have. I have certain height and weight and seat sizes, and unfortunately, if I don't have the equipment to safely serve that individual, I can't work with them. And it's not that I don't want to, it's just my limitations of my program. So don't be afraid to set those limitations, apply them fairly. But those are kind of your solutions for the saddle being too small for the student. And hello, Nancy. Hello, Jerry. Hi, Amy. Thank you guys for joining in. So, small saddle. Have you guys ever ran into a saddle being too small for a student? And what did you guys see? And what solution did you guys use to remedy that problem? I'd love to hear from you guys. So feel free to drop a comment there. All right. Let's talk about saddles being too big for our student. So, solution, like we talked about, of a saddle being too small for a student is to size up to the next size. I don't know about you guys, but I go from a nice little youth saddle to either my bigger Western saddle or my full-size adult dressage saddle. I don't really have an in-between. But it is still a better option to take a student that is too big for this small saddle and to put them into the next size up of saddle, even if that saddle is a little bit too big. However, when we do that, there are some things that we need to be looking for and aware of so that we can set our students up for success and have realistic expectations of them if they're in equipment that is a little bit too big for them. And again, this is assuming that the saddle that is a little bit too big for the student is fitting the horse well. That is primary point number one, most important. Does that saddle fit the horse well? All right, so if we have a student in a saddle that is too big for them, a lot of times what we will see is a posterior pelvis. So them kind of sitting back, maybe getting a little bit slouchy, and the legs getting kind of pulled forward into a chair seat, even if you have those stirrups set at an appropriate length for that rider. And that is because just the basic layout of the saddle and how the rider's body fits into how that saddle is trying to place them. So we're going to take a look more at the dressage saddle because it's a little bit more obvious here. But if I have a little kid that's riding in this dressage saddle, they are going to want to sit right here. This is kind of that dip in the seat, the nice comfy spot. But if I have a tiny little seat and then their legs are in the stirrups that are right here, my stirrup bars are all the way up here. So we have tiny seat here, legs are being pulled forward to where the stirrup bars are, so it's forcing these legs further forward. Few things that we're going to notice from there. One, posterior tilt in the seat, legs are going to be pushing forward, and then back is probably going to slouch a little bit, and the biggest thing you're probably going to notice is that student getting what's called left behind the motion of the horse, because their upper body is probably going to be behind that vertical balance position, because again our whole body's kind of slanted back here because of how the saddle's placing them. So getting left behind the motion, when we might see that, would be going from whoa to walk on, walk to trot, trying to get up into a 2-point, trying to do a posting trot, a sitting trot. This also applies in Western saddles as well. Too big of a saddle, they're going to be kind of swimming around, slushing around in that saddle, and might get left behind that motion. Okay, so something to be aware of. With a saddle being too big for the student, the impact on the horse then could be that student is bobbling around more. So again, depending on how your horse reacts, they could just not move because they're feeling that the student being off balance and they don't want to move forward. The student moving around might cause them to bump on legs more or pull on reins, and then your horse reacts in some way that way. They're getting a little grouchy because their mouth is getting bumped on, or their nose if you're in a bitless bridle. Maybe a leg accidentally cues the horse and they move too fast. The student might struggle with being able to appropriately use their strength to turn the horse or whoa the horse, because if we're leaning behind our horse, that throws off our mechanics when we get to turning and stopping, and just general cueing of the horse to go and stop. But our horse can feel it as well. But it is likely less uncomfortable for the horse to have a student in a little bit bigger saddle than one that is in a smaller saddle and pushing on the back or pushing on the front because they're leaning too far forward, leaning too far back. So, solutions. Actually, before we get to solutions, let's talk about what else we might see from our students. So we talked about kind of position, but a student that is in a saddle that's too big for them, some demeanor things that you might see is that they are a little bit more hesitant, because again, they're kind of moving around a little bit more in that saddle. They might feel a little bit more of that gravitational insecurity. They could be reluctant to try some skills maybe they were able to do in the past before they hit that growth spurt and outgrew that smaller saddle. One, their body proportions have changed, so they've got to learn how to use their new body proportions. And two, that saddle is not supporting them in the same way. And it could just be that overall, the way that the saddle is setting them up is just not setting them up for success, and they might feel like they're fighting against that saddle. So some solutions to a saddle that is too big for your students. One, pay attention to the clothes that they're wearing. The little jodhpur pants that have the grippies on the seat and the legs for both adult and kid riders can help them get a little stick so that they're moving around less in that bigger saddle, both in English and in Western. Half chaps are very helpful to help give the leg a little bit of friction, especially if you are working with a rider who is smaller or lighter weight. So a younger rider, or potentially a rider that maybe has cerebral palsy and they have limited muscles and thin limbs, that friction that is added by the half chap can help them maintain leg position. Something else that you can do is to anchor the stirrup leather down to the billet that is coming out underneath the billet or the girth, and that can help maintain the stirrup position and not have it slip too far forward or slip too far back. So that's a really nice way to kind of keep that leg anchored, give that student a little boost until they grow into the saddle, or maybe they build a little bit of strength in their muscles and in their joints to be able to hold that leg in position underneath of them, even in a little bit bigger saddle. Another option too, check your saddles to see if any of the knee or the thigh rolls can move. Because this, I can actually peel off this whole section and I can move it back underneath the saddle to kind of artificially push that leg back and almost make the seat and leg smaller for this student. Now that doesn't solve the big old seat in the back here, but it does bring that leg underneath of them and their hip and help kind of create a little bit more neutral seat for that student and be able to get them up and out. Again, if they're struggling with getting up and out of the horse or getting left behind the motion, we have to be really aware of cueing that student to appropriately use their body when you're asking them to do things where they might get left behind. So the whoa to walk on, cueing them to use their core or shift that leg underneath of them, or have your sidewalkers apply a heel hold or maybe an ankle block to prevent that leg from slipping forward. Perhaps with our posting, if they're in a bigger saddle, we're not having them ride independently yet. Maybe we're doing lunge line lessons, or where they can hold on to a neck rope or the front strap of the saddle to give them that little bit of help to fight against the physics and the mechanics that's kind of working against them at that point while they're growing into that saddle. So, like I mentioned before, the saddle being too big for the student is a better option than a saddle being too small for a student. And the solutions then again for that saddle being too big for the student, pads, we already had the discussion about pads, may not be a good fit, maybe a good fit. Depends on the size of the rider, depends on the horse, depends on the physical and cognitive ability, depends on your sidewalkers, what you're trying to accomplish. There's lots of factors. So lots of things to think about there. You can adapt your tack and your equipment to maybe give that rider some extra support for a while they move in. Maybe you do groundwork lessons if it just really isn't making your rider feel confident. Don't be afraid to take it back a couple steps and let them get used to the new tack and the equipment, get used to their new body proportions, because usually if it's a rider who's grew out of that small saddle and you're moving into the next size up, they're not only having to get used to the new saddle, but also used to how their new body moves, and the different proportions and how they move through space. Groundwork can be an option. No stirrup work can also be an option too, because then we don't have the stirrup bar and the stirrup leathers pulling that leg forward. So we can get a little bit more neutral seat and neutral leg position, and so it might be a good time to work on no stirrup work as well. Maybe at the walk, maybe in a lunge line at a trot. So again, maybe backing off of trot independence if needed. Lots of things that you can do there. All right, so I'm going to wrap up the chat here. If you're joining in live, let me know if you guys have any questions or comments. Feel free to drop them in there. I can read them from here, so I will read them off if you have questions. Thank you to those of you that joined in live. Remember that I do have a book club going on in July 2021. The link is in the description of the video. That is free. Join in. It's on the language of coaching. I put my book away. Here it is. Free book club on this, and it's totally geared towards adaptive or therapeutic riding instructors. We're going to be going through this. I'm super excited. For more free content, check out hoofballsandfootfalls.com and my YouTube channel. And for those of you that are tuning in late and you want to watch a replay, we talked about what is good fit. How do we determine good fit when it comes to a rider fitting in a saddle? Which is more important? Should we prioritize fit of the saddle to the horse or fit of the saddle to the student? What happens when a saddle is too small for the student? What happens when a saddle is too big? How does it impact the mechanics and even the demeanor or the behavior of our students? How does it impact our equine coworkers, our horses? And then also solutions to if your saddle is too small or if your saddle is too big. So thank you guys for joining in live. Make sure you check out those links. I hope to see you guys in the summer book review, book club. Make sure you get on the email list so you guys can get updates. And please feel free to answer the prompts, even if you guys listened during the replay time. I will see you guys again on the next live chat. Make sure you check out hoofballsandfootfalls.com and the calendar on there. I will be updating my summer free education series. It is hot here, so I've cut back on lessons, which means I get to spend more time with you guys doing these live streams at least once a week. And join my email list. Homepage of Hoof Falls and Footfalls, completely free. I promise I won't share your information. And I send out emails routinely with updated information of blogs or videos or replays or upcoming events. So that's a way that you can stay up to date as well. Thank you guys so much for joining in, and I will see you guys on the next live chat.